Book 2, Part 14. Handling the manor and your honor all at the same time, he whispered with a smile, and I nuzzled him and then laid my head on his leg. Are you sure you're okay with her handling all of that? He smiled and messed with one of my ears, causing me to twitch. Of course I am. Remember, I'm used to having someone that handles all the ugly paperwork. When it's time, they can bring the papers here and we will sign. I looked up at him. We? He laughed. Yes, we. Did you think I was joking when I said it'll be our place? Wow, I hadn't really thought about it. I mean, I guess it was obvious, and I knew, but to sign on the dotted line with him? I suddenly felt a bit overwhelmed and my head spun a little. I lowered my head and closed my eyes to calm the sensation. Am I moving too fast? He whispered. No, just the rest of the world is spinning a bit, I chuckled, and so did he. It's a big step, Raina, buying a home together. I don't want to push you into anything. You have enough people in your life that do that. Another of the million things I love about you, I stated. Then his words hit a different way, and I lifted my head. What do you mean I have enough people pushing me into things? I wasn't angry, just curious about what he meant. Well, let's see. Your dad, my Aunt Mary, those are two pretty big ones. How are they pushing me into things? He chuckled, and I nipped at him. Okay, that was a silly question. Who else? Jonathan shrugged. Isn't that enough? He sounded like he had changed his mind about saying more. Part of me wanted to push him, to find out what he really meant, but I didn't. I was upset enough with people. I didn't want to argue with him. There was a part of me, though, that wondered if he had put my pack on that same list. Did he believe what my dad believed? He had hung out with the guys from the pack, spent time with them. They took him and did that pack talk with him. He couldn't really believe that all the time they hated him and wanted me to be with one of them, could he? I had never really flat out asked him what he thought about it all. I looked at him, watching his face. His beautiful gray eyes smiled at me, and I gave a soft bark. No, he couldn't believe that. My dad may be under this bizarre delusion, but Jonathan couldn't really believe the same way. Still, I didn't ask. A smaller part of me didn't want to see any look cross his face that might hint at the fact that he did. Needed him on my side, by my side through this. If he felt like my dad did, more than just a slight worry, then things would be very awkward. Right now, he was just being cautious and also following my dad's orders. I nodded to myself and decided that's where I would put him on the list of whose side are you on. Aunt Mary was neutral on that one topic, but completely on my good side on everything else. The keeping my honor intact thing was a bit annoying, but she had nothing but good intentions there. Allison, well, she kept out of the loop for the most part, but I'm sure she had heard something, especially with me now being here at Jonathan's aunt's house. She would be on my side no matter what. My brows rose then. Yes, Allison. She would completely agree with me, and I bet she would call Track and talk to him for me. I winced, quickly remembering Paige. Paige may be happy or have sent word that she was, but I had drug her into my problems and she had paid the price for it. I wouldn't ask Allison, or anyone for that matter, to help me again. If something was going to get done, I would do it completely by myself. I think I just decided that I would do something else. I smiled and went to stretch again. My muscles needed it. I yelped when the pain hit and quickly adjusted myself. You have to lay still, Jonathan said softly. I need to find something to keep your mind busy at least. You could read me one of those books we got, I chuckled, and he actually winced. Please tell me you're not serious. I gave a small bark. What, it was okay for me to read them to you, but you won't read them to me? I was teasing him, but the look on his face was utter panic. I could have reminded him that he agreed to read it to me, since I went in the back door at Timmer's, but I figured it wasn't such a good idea to bring up the whole bookstore thing. I could have a TV brought in here and rent us some movies, he tried. Sappy chick flick movies? He nodded, and I laughed. Wow, you really don't want to read one of those books, do you? Not even a little bit, he confessed. But you would have laid there and let me read 'em to you? Of course, he chuckled. That's completely different. I shook my head but nuzzled his stomach. Okay, but I want to pick the chick flick. He gave a theatrical moan. I was hoping you would have mercy on me. Depends. On? On if you get me another delicious steak and then help me with the whole ordering online thing. No thumbs, remember? He laughed hard then and leaned down, kissing the top of my head. I think that's the first time he ever did that with me in wolf form. I liked it. You've got a deal, he whispered, and then looked around. Unfortunately, I will have to get up to do both. I chuckled and moved off his leg. He stood up and shook a finger at me. You stay put. He left the room before I could comment. From the experiment at the bookstore, I knew he could hear me from the other room, but I just smiled and laid back down to wait. A minute later, I heard a phone ringing, and I looked over to see a cell phone on the bed next to me. It must have slipped out of his pocket. I glanced at the screen and growled since I couldn't read what name came up. Since it didn't have a picture of Allison and Joel, I knew it wasn't one of them. The symbols taunted me, and I barked at the device. It finally went quiet, and I growled at it. Another few seconds passed, and it started to ring again. I scooted closer and growled, not even able to tell if it was the same person. Then I nudged it with my nose. Nothing happened. I used my paw and smacked it, but it still rang. I smacked it again, and this time I heard a click. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Hello? Came a voice I didn't recognize. A female's voice. It wasn't his secretary either. Jonathan, are you there? I tilted my head and leaned forward, sniffing at the phone, although I have no idea why. There was a sigh on the other end. Look, I got the information you asked for. Do you want it or not? I barked then, purely out of instinct. The party on the other line was silent for a moment. Jonathan? The bedroom door opened and he walked in, with a bowl in each arm and a thick towel tucked under his arm. I don't want you getting off the bed, so I brought a towel to put over it. Jonathan, is that you? Came a small voice, and he stopped and looked at me. Luckily, he couldn't see the guilt on my face, but I snorted. I accidentally answered your phone. He chuckled, set the bowls down, and picked up the phone. He had to wipe it off with the towel first, then put it to his ear. Hello? As he did, he laid out the towel, doubled on the bed. Yes, sorry about that, was the only explanation he gave the female. My curiosity was bordering on irritation when he picked up the bowl of cut-up steak and set it on the towel. He left the other one filled with water on the floor and then sat down next to me. Yes, well, I'm glad to hear that. I appreciate you looking into it for me. A dog? He laughed. No. I growled, and he wiggled his brows at me and then looked towards the bowl. Suddenly, I wasn't hungry. Okay, well, you can call the office tomorrow. Ask for Max Dormer. Yes, he'll be able to take care of the rest. Okay, so it was business. I glanced around the room looking for a clock, but realized I wouldn't be able to tell what time it was anyhow. Who was this female, and why was she calling my boyfriend? He nudged the bowl with his free hand, and I snorted a huff and laid still, watching him. Thank you again, Mrs. Anders, he stated, emphasizing the name. I'm glad that you were able to sort that out for me. I was beginning to wonder if they had gone out of business and were planning on skirting on their bill. I'm glad that wasn't the case. I quickly lost interest then and stuffed my nose in the bowl. When he hung up, he bent down and picked up the other one with water in it. How in the world did you manage to answer the phone? He chuckled. I was smacking it with my paw to try to shut it up, I confessed, and he laughed again. He had to hold the water bowl so that I didn't knock it over on the bedding. When I was done, he set them on the floor, tossed the towel down with them, and turned to me. Okay, now I'll go grab the laptop and we can order a few movies. I noticed that he left the phone on the bed again, and wondered if he was doing it to further show his innocence, or if I was just reading too much into it. It was just a phone, after all, even though it was usually nearly attached to him. Sure enough, no sooner had he left, it rang again. He told you to call the office, I snarled at it. Mrs. or not, she'd better quit calling my mate. My hackles were up and I glared at it. Then I looked at the screen to make sure a picture of someone we knew didn't pop up. When it didn't, I turned my head and ignored it. Irritating thing. It finally went quiet, although just as he was walking back in, it gave an odd beep. He looked at it, then at me. Didn't answer it for me this time? Ha ha, I said dryly, and he chuckled, moved it, and sat down, opening the computer. I think you have a voicemail. He looked at me, smirking. Jealous of my phone? Sometimes, I chuckled, and he lifted it and pushed a few buttons. I saw the smile slip a little, and he tossed it over onto the chair. There. Not so tempting to try to maul it now. He clicked the keys fast and brought up a website. Well, here we can actually pick the movie and watch it right from the computer, he explained. That way we don't have to wait for anything to be delivered. I nodded and looked at the screen. Luckily, I could see the pictures as he scrolled through a few genres, looking for the right one. I almost felt like tormenting him with a chick flick, but then I would have to endure it as well. We actually settled for an action movie. He moved back so that he was propped up on the pillows, and I laid next to him on my good side, with my head on his leg. We were enjoying the movie when his phone beeped again. It didn't ring, it just gave a few quick beeps. Text message, he explained, and didn't get up. If it wasn't important to him, it wasn't important to me, so I ignored it too. At one point it did ring again. This time he did get up. He grabbed the phone, looked at the screen, and then pushed a button. You better keep it turned on. What if my dad calls? He shrugged. He'll call the main house number or Michael's phone if it's that important. Wow, that was impressive and brave. Jonathan got comfortable again, and we were able to watch the rest of the movie in peace. As the credits were rolling, Michael showed up, tapping on the half-open door. We both looked over at him, and he stepped into the room, his phone in his hand. Mr. Blvd, he explained as he walked over and handed it to Jonathan, who took it. He told my dad I was following orders and had stayed on the bed. We're watching movies and taking it easy, he further explained, laying one hand on my back. I nuzzled him. Tell my dad I want my phone back, I stated, suddenly remembering to be irritated about that. When he only looked at me, I gave a harsh bark, knowing my dad would hear and ask him what I said. He gave me a semi-hard look and told my father. Then he brought the phone down and hit the speakerphone button. "Raina," I barked in response. "You are perfectly welcome to your phone when you shift back. I don't see how much good it's going to do you at the moment," he chuckled, but I could hear the concern in his voice. "Is that a promise?" I barked and looked at Jonathan. He moaned, and my dad replied, "I said you can have your phone when you shift. I also hear that you and Jonathan have decided on the mini manor, as you call it." When I barked again, he replied, "Good choice. It's an excellent starter home, and the property will only increase in value." He paused. "Well, I'm sure Raina would rather not talk real estate. Jonathan, you and I will talk about that later. Sweetheart, I heard that you're resting, but I also know that you'll be getting edgy and will want to move around. You really need to rest. Stay in that bed for a full 24 hours until that wound can heal enough not to rip open again." I gave a whiny growl and then a small bark. 24 hours, sweetheart." "But Allison and Joel are coming over to visit," I barked, again with a small whimper. "Allison and Joel are coming over to visit," Jonathan translated. "Ah, yes. Well, then you can be moved out into the sitting room for the visit, but you are not to walk there yourself, and you are not to walk around. I want you laying down, or I will come up there and sit next to you for a full 24 hours, he added with a chuckle. Now I loved my dad, but his threat hit home, and I barked back, this time with Jonathan laughing. "I'll make sure she follows the instructions." I gave him a tight look, and he winked at me. "Well, it seems Aunt Mary has the house situation under control, so I'll come by tomorrow night and visit for a while. Hopefully you'll still be shifted. You'll heal faster and better in that form for the next 2 days." I barked again. "I love you, Dad." Jonathan cleared his throat, but my dad understood. "I love you too, sweetheart." He clicked the phone off and shook his head at me. "You definitely keep life interesting," he chuckled, handing the phone back to Michaud. "Ask him about Paige," I barked. "Tell him to tell her how sorry I am. Tell him—" But Michael had left the room. I glared at him, and he shook his head, coming back over and sitting on the bed. "Aunt Mary said that they want to keep it a secret," he reminded me. "Even from us?" I asked, shocked and a little hurt. "I think they deserve their privacy right now, don't you?" Okay, so he had a point, but I still planned on calling her the first chance I had. I needed to apologize. That option kept getting taken away from me, and I wasn't going to let this one slip away like the other one had. We were halfway through the next movie when there was another knock on the door. It was still halfway open, due to Aunt Mary, so we both watched and waited. Then the smell hit me. I barked loudly and lifted my head, ignoring the pain in my side, as Allison pushed the door open and smiled. Joel walked in behind her, also smiling. Jonathan stood up, gave me a hard look that said, "Don't even think about getting off that bed," and then walked over. He and Joel did that guy-high thing where they shook hand and then did a quick half hug. Guys were so odd sometimes. Allison gave Jonathan a quick hug and then moved straight towards me. I was still laying, but was on my stomach. My tail slapped the bed hard. She sat down, reached over, and wrapped her arms carefully around my neck. "I am so glad you're okay," she whispered, and then sat back up. She glanced at my bandaged side and winced. "Tell me you're going to be okay." "She'll be fine. She just has to stay in bed for the next 24 hours, Jonathan explained as he and Joel walked over. I gave a small bark and she bit her lower lip. "When I heard what happened," she shook her head. "A buck, Raina? You could have been badly hurt." Her blue eyes tightened and she hugged me again. "They should have never let you run out there with those beasts." I lowered my head a little and Jonathan shifted uneasily. "It is deep but not dangerous. It was all an accident, actually." Allison sat up, shaking her head. Accident or not, she should never have been running out there alone. Wow, I had never seen her look so angry before. She kissed the top of my head and asked what the doctors were doing, and then asked me how bad it hurt. I didn't have a chance to answer or think one for Jonathan to translate. Finally she huffed, which looked so out of place on her soft face. Maybe I need to stay closer to you. Her head bobbed a bit. These men. She actually growled a little bit, and my brows went up. Wow, was all I could think. Then I turned to see Jonathan looking at his shoes. Joel had gone quiet, and they both looked like they wanted to slip out of the room. I nudged her arm and gave a soft bark. Trying to make Jonathan translate his own innocence just seemed wrong. When I nudged her again, the frown lightened a bit, and she shook her head. You do seem to know how to liven things up, that's for sure. I laughed inside and gave a hearty bark, then winced. Dang, that kind of hurt. Finally she turned and looked directly at Jonathan. He seemed to shrink a little. She flipped her gorgeous hair and then shook a finger at him. You need to be more careful with her, she started, and I nudged her again. It wasn't his fault, and I needed her to know that. I know it wasn't your fault, she said, although the pause at the end said a bit otherwise. But Raina is, well, she shouldn't be put in dangerous situations. Jonathan went to open his mouth, and mine flopped open. I really had never seen her this way. She sighed, and all the anger fell away. I was just so worried, she nearly whispered, then looked at Joel. We got here as soon as we heard. Joel nodded, a little uncomfortable. Allison was worried that, in wolf form, that Raina could, die, I thought, and looked up at her. If she had tear ducts, she would be sobbing for the sadness that was on her face. That explained a lot and also made me smile. She really was an amazing friend. Here she snapped at Jonathan, which was completely out of her character, and then she had worried that I might die, and it bothered her this much. Wow. I never really had a girlfriend. Missy was the closest thing. It was nice. I shoved my nose under her arm, and she turned and hugged me again. Can you please let her know that I'm fine, that I can heal easier in this form, and that I'm completely blown away that she cares so much? I said, letting my eyes move to Jonathan. He smiled then. Raina wants me to let you know that she's doing well. It's actually better for her to heal in this form. Werewolves have an amazing healing ability in their own right. She also wants me to tell you how much it means to her that you came. Allison smiled and looked at me. Of course I came. The minute I heard, she chuckled, stroking the top of my head. Why don't we all go out into the living room, Joel stated. This room is nice, but a little cramped, he chuckled at the end to try to lighten the mood. Allison looked at me and I barked, attempting to sit up more. Jonathan came to the bed quickly. He spared me the gurney and lifted me in his arms. I yelped at first and then gripped my teeth as he walked into the main sitting room, and I was laid on one of the couches. She's bleeding, Allison gasped, and Jonathan frowned, looking at my white bandage that was quickly becoming red. Oh, my dad was gonna flip. One of the doctors had stayed behind and quickly stepped up. The blood is bright and wet. Good signs, he said as he leaned over and pulled the gauze wrapping away to look a bit underneath it. I twisted around to watch. She has to keep still. The next 12 to 24 hours should have the deep tissue healed. If she keeps ripping it, there could be more damage, he stated, looking at Jonathan. He sighed. I shouldn't have carried her. Don't you dare blame yourself, I barked, and the doctor stood. The bandage will hold. Once your company leaves, I'll change it. Perhaps I should put a few sutures in it to help hold it together. There was an underlying accusation in his words, basically telling Jonathan, yes, he shouldn't have lifted me. I growled softly, then turned to Allison, who was sitting next to me looking very worried. Tell her I'm fine, please. I can't stand any more people looking at me that way. Jonathan sat at the other end of me and smiled at Allison. She says to tell you she's fine and will be up and getting into more trouble in no time. He and Joel chuckled, but Allison's brows crinkled. I threw in the last part as a joke, he explained. She nodded without smiling and turned to me. Raina, please do what the doctors say. You've been through so much already. I hate seeing you hurt. It's just a scratch, I barked softly, then nudged her arm. That did get a smile out of her. It was really hard to visit without being able to talk to her, but it was nice to have them there. Jonathan had to stay in the room with us so he could translate, but he and Joel moved to the other side of the room and talked amongst themselves a bit. 3 months, she smiled at me. I can believe that Jonathan's aunt got Vampire Society to accept that, but still, she wiggled excitedly. Have you decided where you'll have the celebration? I turned and looked at Jonathan, who turned. We haven't decided yet. What? She gasped, looking at me and then back at him. But you have to. 3 months. Most places are booked a year in advance. The guys walked back over, her eyes locked on Jonathan, and he smiled as he sat down. I don't care where we have it, he stated, reaching out and stroking my back. We've already found a place to live, and I'm only waiting this long because Aunt Mary would stake me if I tried to push it any faster. Indeed I would, came her sing-song voice as she walked into the room, smiling. Of course, Allison and Joel both had to endure her now famous bear hug. Then she shooed Jonathan to the chair and took his seat. They have purchased a delicious little manor outside the city, she explained, and Allison wiggled excitedly. I did love Allison, but she was such a girly girl. The realtors thought they were playing with people who didn't know their little game, Jonathan's aunt proclaimed with a huff. Who is the agent? Joel asked, looking at Jonathan. The Arcus brothers, he replied, and Joel gave a soft whistle. Those two are ruthless. Another huff from Aunt Mary. Not at all. I showed them what it's like to play with a professional. In the end, they were begging us to take the place. Impressive, he laughed, and she nodded. It's not the sale of one house that matters to those two, she explained. It's the connections and the ability to name drop. She looked at Jonathan. My nephew is no low man on his own. I saw my boyfriend's jaw twitch. Yes, we had gotten the deal based on her and my father, period. She winked at him. But now your name has 10 times the power it ever did. Jonathan's eyes lowered, and I gave him a soft whimper of support and apology. He didn't want to ride my father's wave to fame. He was proud and had worked very hard to get where he was. I wanted to go to him and sat up a little. He quickly shook his head at me and blew me a very small kiss that the others missed. I settled back down, but looked at him a bit longer. Allison smiled. I can't wait to see it, she said, then glanced at me. You only have 3 months to get it ready, she shook her head. No small feat for someone who actually likes that sort of thing. She grinned at me and I snorted. Yeah, she was right. I had no idea how to decorate my own bedroom, let alone an entire house. The manor was old and eclectic. The things there were a wonderful mix of old and new. Pieces were added but never taken away, unless I broke them. I felt a small wave of panic and then winced, hoping Aunt Mary wouldn't offer to do this too. I appreciated her help with the purchase, the upgrades, and everything, but I was worried that she would soon take over our lives. I could help some if you'd like, Allison nearly whispered. I turned to her and smiled inside. I would like that a lot, I barked, and Jonathan quickly translated. Her blue eyes lit up and she nodded, trying to hold in her excitement. As soon as you're better, we can have a look and start getting some ideas, she smiled. I have an aunt that's an interior decorator. Maybe we can take some pictures of the place and send them to her to get her feedback. I gave a heavy sigh and she frowned. Oh, we don't have to do that if you don't want. Jonathan laughed. That was a sigh of relief, he explained, and she smiled again. I really wish I could shift back, I hissed, a few minutes later while everyone was talking. This is really annoying. Jonathan turned and shook his head at me. Allison followed his gaze and she nodded. It must be very frustrating being stuck in your wolf form and not able to talk, she grinned. I like that Jonathan can hear you, though. It's very romantic. She winked at me and my eyes widened. Finally, Joel stood. Well, Allison and I should be going. He shot me a quick smile, with a patient on the mend and all. Oh, do we have to go? She whimpered, and I grinned. I really did like her. She must be bored out of her mind. She avoided Aunt Mary's look that time. Joel walked over to her, took her hand, and helped her up. I'm sure she is, but she doesn't need us here reminding her of that. He turned and looked down at me. How about we come back after the 24 hours is up? You can shift back then, right? I nodded, and Jonathan stepped up. Joel shrugged. Then we'll come back, and Jonathan and I will find something else to do, and you two can sit and have your girl talk for as long as you like. How's that? I barked happily, and Allison smiled. I'd like that. Jonathan chuckled. We'll have to find something to do for several hours. Then he looked at Allison. I have some pictures of the house, inside and out. I can email them to you if you'd like. Give you a head start on some ideas? She beamed and nodded, then reached down and gave me a sincere hug around my neck. Please lay still so they don't make us wait any longer, she giggled, and I barked. I watched them leave, both of them turning at the elevator and waving to me. I was sad to see her go. She was a piece of more normal life that I was seriously missing. Joel took her hand, and the door slid closed. I whimpered and lowered my head onto the couch, not looking up when Jonathan came back and sat next to me. Now see, that's something to look forward to, right? Yes, I thought, without much enthusiasm, as I should have. When I felt him look down at me, I sighed. I want a normal life, Jonathan, I confessed, and he reached down and stroked the back of my neck. I know you do, and I will do everything I can to give that to you. Then he chuckled. But you have to meet me halfway. I huffed. Okay, so I did have a way of getting into trouble even without trying. But the point was, I never did it intentionally. I was tired of house hopping, tired of the pain in my heart, tired of being torn in so many emotional directions. I yawned. I was just tired of it all. Want to go back into the bedroom? Yes, please, I stated quietly, the self-pity sinking in and dampening my mood even more. He turned and Martin wheeled over the moving bed. They both lifted me carefully and laid me on it. It was then I realized Aunt Mary was no longer in the room. As they pushed me towards the hallway, I tried to remember when she had left. Back on the bed, I adjusted myself on my side. I was going to lay still and be good. Allison's warning sunk in. As much as I wanted to jump off the bed and move around, I didn't want to make this take any longer. So, I would be a good pup and lay still, do what the doctors told me to do, and whatever it took to heal faster and get out of this place. By the end of the night, I was ready to go completely mad. My wolf form was itching to move, no matter the gash in my side. My skin twitched and my muscles protested at the restrictions. We finished the movie we had stopped when Allison and Joel arrived. Then Jonathan got me more food and water, and I finished both. Yes, I was hungry, but it was just more for something to do. Finally, I yawned again, my body wanting to sleep, just to pass the time. Jonathan made sure I was comfortable, and the doctor came in and changed my bandage. Afterwards, he explained that I wouldn't need stitches, and that the healing was coming along well. I was proud of that fact, and fell asleep shortly after. The next evening was even harder. I was feeling much better, and ached to get up, but my 24 hours wasn't quite up yet. My dad showed up, and he watched the doctor change my bandages again, watching him and also commenting on how well it was coming along. "So when can I shift back?" I asked, looking at Jonathan, who stood with them. He asked the question, and the doctor shrugged. "If she can stay in this form for another 2 days." I barked hard and sat up. 2 days? I barked again. They said 24 hours. My dad put his hand up, then leaned over and gently pushed me back down. "You were to lay still for 24 hours. He sat next to me. "Raina, you will likely heal faster in this form. You would heal in your real form, but it's the shifting process that we are worried about." My real form? I hadn't realized just how much my dad disliked werewolves. Now his voice dripped of it. I wondered if he had always felt that way, then shook my head. My mother was half werewolf, so that couldn't be true. "The shifting is a dangerous thing just now," he continued, and I turned and refocused on the conversation. It could do a lot more damage. I growled low, not because I wanted to argue. Okay, so I did, but what he said made sense. My body could quickly heal in either form, though it seemed to do it a bit faster in this one. But the trauma of shifting would probably very quickly undo all the progress I had made, and like he said, make it even worse. I sighed. Great. I was stuck in this form for another 2 days. I snorted, and my dad smiled. "I know it's hard, but you've been doing well. You should be able to get up and walk around tomorrow." "Tomorrow? But the 24 hours is almost up," I barked. Now I was getting ticked. Was this some kind of trick? One of those things that parents do to keep making their child think that if they were good just a little while longer, they would get the prize. Jonathan looked just as frustrated, but my dad smiled at me. "We needed to look at the wound again, sweetheart. It is healing very well, but you need to understand that it was rather a deep injury." It was a deer, I thought. It wasn't a bear or a tiger or something ferocious. It was a deer. Bambi. "Bambi on steroids, maybe," Jonathan chuckled, and I realized I thought it with the part he could hear. My dad smiled. It was a full-grown, very experienced buck. He looked at me and my head dipped a little. "That buck was used to protecting its territory, sweetheart. It lives in that reserve, watching over its herd. Yes, it was an accident, but you didn't stand a chance." I huffed and turned my head away. "Fine, you have 2 more days." Jonathan gave a small laugh, and my dad looked at him. He shrugged and translated, word for word. My dad laughed and then smiled at me. "Well, thank you, sweetheart. I appreciate that." Okay, so I felt a little funny after that comment, but I lifted my head and raised my chin a little. I was not that inexperienced at protecting myself. Another snort, and I figured I'd better stop while I was ahead. "You said you'll give it 2 days," my dad smiled, playfully shaking a finger at me. "Can she stay shifted that long?" Jonathan asked, and the smile wilted on my dad's face. They all turned and looked at me. I shook my head hard. "I don't know," I stated, and Jonathan told them. "Well, you do what you can. The longer the better," my dad stated, no longer smiling as easily. What would happen to me if I shifted before I was healed enough? The neck injury was one thing. The worst that could have happened there was I could have bled out if I had pulse when I shifted. I flinched and then mentally shrugged. Having my side shredded as my body went through the torment of shifting was not something that thrilled me. If you feel like you have to shift and you can't hold it, you let us know right away, he stated, the smile completely gone now. I nodded and then put my head on my front paws. Just a few months ago, my life was calm, normal, even boring. I used to crave excitement, looking out the window, watching movies, always wishing something would happen in my life. Now, I would give anything to be that kind of bored again. Jonathan said something to my dad, and I sighed. Okay, as long as I could still meet and fall in love with him. I chuckled inside my mind then. What a life I had. Chapter 18. Phil jumped off the bed. They're moving her again. Everyone in the room moved and surrounded him. He looked towards the hotel door, then to Ryan. The main alpha gave a low growl. Do they really think moving her around so much will keep us away? It's going to tick her off sooner or later too, Track stated, and Jackson nodded his agreement. How do you know that they're moving her? Ryan asked. Maybe they're just making another store run. Phil shrugged and Rock stepped up. Do we wait until she's too far away for him to track? 8 sets of eyes watched the alpha. Ryan sighed and then gave Phil a hard look. It had taken him half the night to track down the clique alpha. He had to shift and roam the streets of the city, hiding in alleyways and skirting the humans that walked without knowing they existed. He had taken Marcus and Track with him, and luckily, Phil had shifted, and he had finally come into mental territory he needed to cow the runaway. They found him, ironically enough, back in the little park near the bookstore. When they had gotten back to the hotel, Ryan had lost his temper. Phil took it, staying low and as still as possible. He had tried to follow her on 4 legs. Then finally his senses kicked in, and he knew he needed to get back to the pack. So he went back to the last place he knew, the park. Ryan had raged and even threatened to send him back to Polson for a stunt. Phil did speak up then. He had apologized many times, and when that didn't work, he pointed out that he was the only one that can sense her from any distance. After that, Phil stayed very submissive and very quiet, keeping as far from Ryan as possible. Ryan wanted to make him stay here. He was still more than ticked, and also didn't trust that he wouldn't run off again. Unfortunately, he also knew they needed him along. If you so much as flinch at the wrong time, he hissed, looking at Phil. Phil lowered his head and nodded. Ryan sighed. Grab your coats. Let's go. Rock and Jackson slapped each other a high five as they grabbed their coats and headed out of the hotel room. When they were in the parking lot, Ryan turned. Track, Phil, Jackson, and Otis, come with me. The others jumped into the second SUV, and Ryan turned to the back seat. So, which way? Phil pointed, and Ryan nodded, started the car, and headed out. Track pulled out his regular cell phone and pushed a few buttons. Nothing, he hissed. He was worried about Tricia, the girl that helped them at the bookstore. He had tried to call her a dozen times and got nothing, not even voicemail now. They were all sure the vampires were to blame. So, what are you getting? Jackson asked, on the seat across from them. Just a direction, and... Phil's eyes tightened. She seems excited. Excited? Jackson and Track spat at the same time. Maybe they aren't moving her, Otis stated, looking back from the front seat, his black eye already a dirty yellow color. Ryan nodded. Either way, we might get a chance to see her this time, he stated, and then turned down another road when Phil gave the direction. She isn't going to be alone, Track stated, his face tight. Michael and his mini-me at least. The vampire boy is probably there with her too. The vampire boy is now what they called Jonathan when they didn't feel like saying his name. He had actually almost liked the guy, but now he was no better than the rest of them. He had texted him, trying to get his help to sort this mess out. At first the vampire had replied, telling him it was best if they stayed away. Finally, he had just stopped responding at all. Phil smiled and Track turned to him. He shrugged. "I can sense her excitement. It feels good," he confessed. Track gave a hard nod and turned to the window. Phil could sense her general mood or state of mind at times. Track felt for his clique alpha. While that gift would be amazing if they were together, he wondered how painful it was to sense when she was with the vampire. "She wouldn't be excited about a store run," Jackson pointed out. Otis nodded. "Or about being moved again." "If they told her that's what they're doing," Ryan replied. "Otis is right. She isn't going to enjoy being moved around. They might have told her something else was happening, to get her to cooperate." "They're heading out of the city," Phil stated, pointing to the freeway. The traffic was minimal this time of night, so the car behind them didn't have any trouble keeping up. Ryan's phone rang. He glanced at it and then handed it to Otis, who answered it. "They're going to need to stop for gas soon." Ryan huffed, then groaned when he looked down at his own gas gauge. That was a stupid mistake. They should have gassed up before they checked in. He had never had to deal with a situation like this, but making sure the cars had fuel should have been an obvious thing to do. He gave a hard nod to Otis, who said something into the phone and then hung up. A few minutes later, Ryan turned off the freeway, following Phil's directions. They pulled over at the first gas station and everyone climbed out except Phil and Track. Otis leaned against one of the back doors, and Marcus poked his head in the other. "Any idea yet?" he asked. Track knew they were actually blocking the doors, but he also understood why. Part of him was a bit jealous of the connection Phil had with Raina, but he was also a bit ticked at him for taking off. It was stupid, careless, and made them have to stop looking for Raina and go looking for him. Phil shook his head. "Still the same." "Still excited?" Track asked, and he nodded. "Excited?" Marcus asked, and Track and Phil both nodded. "Well, it doesn't sound like they're moving her then," he stated, leaning on the side of the car, but still blocking the door. "Unless they told her something else to make sure she'd go," Track hissed. Marcus sighed and nodded. He was still new to the pack, but fiercely loyal. He had never belonged to one before, and he coveted the feeling now. It wasn't something he could explain if he had to, but he would die for any of them now, including Raina. The wolf's obsession with her was contagious, and he was just as determined to find her and get her away from the vampires. He had lived outside a pack all his life. He saw the true character of the undead ones that smiled in their faces. They were vicious, crazed about their own kind, and thought they were the only important race that walked the planet. The ones they were dealing with were more than just powerful. Their power was like an iceberg. What you saw was massive by itself, but underneath it was mind-blowing. They had centuries to weave their networks, much longer than a wolf. When everyone climbed back into their own cars, Phil pointed the way and Ryan drove off. Otis passed out the hot dogs, chips, and drinks he had bought, and they all ate them quickly. "They've stopped," Phil stated several minutes later. Ryan looked up in the mirror and Phil nodded. "They aren't moving anymore." "How much further?" Jackson asked him. Phil frowned in concentration. "About 20 minutes. Turn right up there." Ryan nodded and turned off the main road. They were now on a 2-lane road that was still well paved, but was now flanked by trees and wired fences. The Alpha slowed. "We'll have to pull off soon. We can't drive right into them, and they probably have scouts." "Probably," Track snorted, and the others nodded. Otis dialed the car behind him and gave him the update. 5 minutes later, Ryan turned left onto a small unpaved road. He pulled back far enough that both cars wouldn't be seen from the road. Then he turned off the car and looked back. Phil, if I have to worry about you, I'm not going to be able to concentrate on this. I won't run off again, Phil whispered, his head dipping again. Part was the submission to his alpha, part was the embarrassment for what he had done earlier, and another small part was frustration that he hadn't been able to find her. A few minutes later, Ryan opened the door and they all climbed out. It was completely dark here, no street lights, but that didn't bother the wolves even on two legs. The main alpha watched Phil, who was getting a bit antsy now. It was obvious now why they brought her out here, at least in part. They brought her here to let her run, Marcus stated, and the others nodded, inhaling the smells and also enjoying the setting. Ryan looked around. It's a good place for it. She's been cooped up too long. Track growled something and Phil smiled, closing his eyes. She's enjoying it, he whispered. I can sense her more now. She's out there. He opened his eyes, looking over the hood of the car. Running. Rock chuckled. Maybe she'll take off and then we can intercept her. Maybe we should shift and go find her, Jackson put in. If she's on four legs, we could find her easily and get her out of there. She isn't alone, Brian reminded him, and Jackson shrugged. So what? If she's shifted, they won't stand a chance. Rock nodded his agreement, bouncing a little on his feet. He was itching to change too. The smells around him didn't make it any easier. Phil kept looking over the car, and Ryan gave Dan and Otis a nod. The two stepped up next to the Click Alpha and went on alert, watching him carefully. Phil pretended not to notice. His body was alive, and he crossed his arms to hide the shaking. She was so close, just through those trees. He could sense her, feel her adrenaline and her excitement, and every part of him ached to join her. He remembered the feel of her fur rubbing against his, and he gave a small sigh. The bond was hard on him, mentally, emotionally, and physically. It took all the willpower he had, coupled with the strong authority of his alpha, not to go and claim her right now. His heart and mind needed her, but he also knew that if he rushed in and tried to take her, she just might run. That thought nearly broke his heart. His eyes watered and he turned away. She didn't remember that night in the forest, in their cave. Ryan had told him and the others that had visited her and had confirmed it. It could very well be that she had no feelings for him at all. Yes, she was having a strange feeling, but she didn't have any idea what it was. She was with that vampire and felt that she loved him. When they finally did find her, he knew there was a good chance she would turn him away. I would die, he thought. The bond was so strong that he knew he couldn't live without her. If she did deny him, he knew he wouldn't survive. Hope was the only thing that kept him going now. The hope that maybe, if she saw him, she would feel it too. Are we just going to stand here? Rock finally huffed, and Phil looked back. Ryan nodded. For now. Why don't we send scouts? Jackson exclaimed, and then winced when his alpha turned a hard stare on him. We will, Ryan snapped, but I want to make sure she's out there running alone. When they all turned to Phil, he shrugged. I can't tell. I can almost make out the smells, he whispered, and Jackson's eyes widened. He and the others were still in awe of the bond between their Click Alpha and their pack sister. Witnessing Aote firsthand was something that had never entered his mind. He was one of the ones that had always laughed it off as a story that the older female wolves liked to tell. Trees, damp leaves, decay, Phil whispered, closing his eyes and inhaling slowly as if he were there. Track looked around and realized those smells were right here as well, but he didn't doubt that Phil was picking up on them through Raina. Part of him still envied his packmate for the intense bond with his best friend. Phil opened his eyes and looked at him. Something passed between them, and Track smiled, giving a small nod. Phil had worried about Track at first. He, as well as the others in the pack, had always believed that Track was in love with Raina, and either hid it well or didn't realize it. They were so close to each other and had a special bond of their own. The two of them had talked, though. Track did love her, deeply and sincerely, but he was not in love with her. It went deeper than brother and sister. They were best friends that had spent the better part of the last century together. Now Phil and Track had a bond of their own, one they didn't have before. Raina was the reason for that bond. They both loved her deeply in their own way. Ryan straightened. Okay, we'll send 2 scouts to check things out. He looked at the eager faces in front of him. There was no way he was sending either Phil or Track. They were loyal to the death, but in this situation, he knew better than to tempt them. Rock and Jackson weren't very level-headed when they got riled, so he pointed. Marcus and Brian. Jackson let out a disappointed sigh as the 2 stepped up. Don't get too close. They'll probably have their own scouts, and we also don't want them catching your scents. Their noses are useless, Rock chuckled. Ryan shrugged. 2 to a point, but the bodyguards are a little better. Track wanted to go. He wanted to argue, but he also knew why he wasn't picked. He glanced over at Phil, who shrugged. Yeah, it would be a bad idea. If either one of them caught sight of her, they wouldn't have been able to stop, no matter what order had been given. He leaned against the hood of the SUV, and Ryan started to take his shirt off. I'm going to shift. That way we can stay in contact. Marcus and Brian stripped as well, and soon 2 wolves trotted through the trees, the larger ash-colored one standing and watching them. Jackson hopped up on the hood, Rock following him. Otis and Dan stayed by Track and Phil, tense and ready to slam either of them if they moved wrong. Track chuckled. Although he knew the other 2 were more experienced, he still remembered Brian and Otis's condition after Phil had dealt with them on his own. Yes, he had been crazed by the bond, but if he could take them both alone? Track shook his head to force the thought out. He couldn't get stupid now. The knowledge that she was so close was hard, though. He turned and looked the way the others had gone. So close, he whispered, and Otis stepped up. I'm not running off, he hissed, but think about it. He gestured to the tree line. She's right out there, running as a wolf, without us. Otis sighed and nodded. Ryan turned and gave a soft growl. Track put his hands up. I'm not going anywhere, but... Track turned then. He noticed Phil was starting to shake. Maybe we should sit in the car. When Phil nodded, Track followed him to the back door and they both got in. Dan trotted over and leaned against one door, Otis on the other. We deserve that, I guess, Track chuckled, looking at the back of Otis's head, but it's still irritating. When Phil only nodded, Track turned. How bad is it? Phil had his arms crossed hard against his chest. Like you said, she's right out there. Track sighed. Yeah. Phil sat back against the seat but kept his arms crossed. She's enjoying herself, he said with a small smile. Track nodded. I bet she is. They've kept her locked up all this time. The smile dropped from Phil's face and he turned. We will get her back, he stated. You bet we will, Track smiled. The minutes ticked by and they waited. The 2 guards stayed posted at the doors and Ryan paced quietly outside. Suddenly, Phil shot up. She's hurt, he yelled and reached for the door. Dan caught it and held it tight, not letting him out. She's hurt, Phil spat, and Ryan's face appeared in the crack. What happened? Track snapped, half out of his seat as well. I don't know. Her side. Phil put a hand on his own side. It's not life-threatening, but it's bad. Let us out of here, Track roared, glaring at Dan. He glanced at his own door, but it was still blocked. Ryan let out a deep but quiet growl, and Phil shook his head. We have to go find her. Now. He tried to open the door, but the weight on the other side was too great. You can't expect us to just sit here now, Track yelled over Phil. That's exactly what you both will do, Dan hissed, leaning over his Alpha, both hands against the car door. Did you hear me? Phil hissed, his eyes wide. Raina is hurt. I heard you, but you two will stay in this car. Ryan calls the shots, remember? His voice was tight, but they both noticed it was edged with worry, too. Phil ran both his hands through his hair. We have to go find her. We have to help her. His face was at the window now, his hands in fists and his eyes wide. She's not alone, remember, Dan replied, and Track punched his seat. Ryan growled again and then turned. When he looked back, he tightened his eyes and growled again. This time the vibrations ran through them all. It was the Alpha voice, and it was dripping with a threat. Stay here or else, it said, in a way no words could. Then the ash wolf turned and ran off. Phil got the door open part way, but Dan reached in and pushed him back, leaning in. He's going, and the other two are out there. They will find her. Why can't we go? Track yelled, hardly able to keep to the seat. Dan chuckled. You don't seriously think I need to answer that, do you? Dan shook a finger at Phil. And if you pull a stunt like you did before, I will beat you into the ground. He was bigger and taller than the two Phil had downed in town, but the adrenaline, rage, and fear running through him didn't care. Rock and Jackson were freaking out behind them, and Otis finally opened the door and shoved the two of them in as well. What are we doing sitting here? Jackson spat, glaring at Dan now. Doing what we are told and waiting, came a tight reply. Phil grabbed his side again, his eyes wide. How bad is it? Rock asked, his voice low and tight. She's in a lot of pain, Phil whispered, his voice shaking. But she'll survive. Do you know what happened? Dan asked, his own face tight. No, came the hard reply. Track shook his head. We can't just sit here. Marcus, Brian, and Ryan against how many vampires? Jackson nodded. If they brought her out here to run, they would have secured the place. It's probably crawling with the bats. Otis opened his door, shoved Track over, and crawled in, locking the door as he closed it. We go if Ryan gives us the signal to go. Otherwise, we stay put. Phil started to shake more, and they all watched him. This was driving them all crazy, but they could only imagine how much harder it was for the click Alpha that was connected to her. How could they let this happen? Track growled. All those vampires and one female, and she gets hurt, right under their noses. What kind of place did they take her to? Otis spat, and they all nodded. They have no idea what a wolf needs, or how to take care of one, let alone her, Jackson hissed. The tension was heavy in the back seats of the SUV. They would all get quiet, and then someone would start spitting out threats to the vampires, and the others would quickly join in. I can't stand the waiting, Phil growled, looking over Dan and out the window. How long has Ryan been gone? About 10 minutes, Otis chuckled, and Phil rolled his eyes and slammed back against the seat. He laid his head back and rubbed his hand over his face. I should be there. I should be taking care of her. They don't have any idea. That brought the silence back again, and everyone got lost in their own thoughts. The minutes passed by slowly, and Dan and Otis started to worry that they would have to fight all 4 of their pack brothers any minute to keep them in the car. Finally, they heard a rustle outside, and they all turned. Then they saw 3 wolves run out of the trees. and Phil shoved Dan out of the way and reached for the door. "Slow down, pup," he snapped, and pushed the other back. A few minutes later, Ryan reached out and opened the door, Marcus and Brian now standing behind him. Ryan looked around the first car to make sure everyone was still there. Then his eyes moved to Track and finally to Phil. They brought her out of the forest on a board, he stated, and Rock slammed one fist into the other hand. Ryan ignored him, keeping his focus on the Click Alpha. "We couldn't get close enough to make contact. They scented us." Phil looked up past him, but Ryan shook his head. "They're more worried about her at the moment." "They should have been worried before," Jackson spat in a hard whisper, and Ryan's soft growls silenced them. "They're cleaning her up near their cars, planning to take off as soon as they can." "Why don't we go now?" Track hissed. "We can attack, take her, and get her away from them." The Alpha shook his head. "There are about 25 vampires back there, and they're armed." "How did she manage to get hurt with that kind of protection?" Otis snapped. "Because they're idiots," Brian shot from outside. "Vampires are arrogant," Ryan hissed. "They figured that sheer numbers would be all that was needed to keep her safe." "They probably let her run out there alone," Rock snapped. Ryan drew in a slow breath. "We're going to follow them when they leave." Phil sat up and the Alpha nodded. "We'll stay far enough back, but this has gone on long enough." "Yes!" Rock and Jackson shouted, smiling. Finally, Ryan had been pushed too far. "Otis, Dan, you two stay here with these two. Rock, Jackson in the other car with Brian and Marcus. Jackson, you drive." When Jackson went to get up, Ryan pointed a finger around the space. "If any of you so much as tries to get a little stupid, I will personally beat you senseless." Jackson chuckled and Ryan shook his head. "I mean it. I will send all of you back to Polson and call out others to help. I'm done playing follow the vampires. We are going to get Raina out of there. If I have to worry about the four of you two especially," he stated, shooting Phil and Track a hard look, "I will send you home with more than your tail between your legs. Is that understood?" Four heads nodded quickly. Ryan was not only a force to be reckoned with, he was also mad. His eyes were tight, his stance was hard, and he was also offering them what they wanted. They were going to get Raina away from the vampires. And I'm going to stop there.